The global economy doesn't grow evenly. It moves in powerful waves, driven by a few key players that quietly shape everything from jobs and trade to inflation and opportunity worldwide. In the top 10 contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026, we break down who is truly driving the world economy forward and why it matters more than ever right now. This isn't about hype or headlines. It's about real economic weight, global influence, and the countries adding the most momentum to global growth behind the scenes. You'll discover how population, production, consumption, and strategic positioning determine who moves the global numbers, and why some countries matter far more than their news coverage suggests. By the end of this video, you'll see the world economy differently, with clarity on where growth is coming from and what that means for the future. Watch till the end to see which economy sits at the very center of global growth in 2026. If you enjoy smart global analysis like the video, subscribe to Mr. Globe TV for more world-level economic insights. Comment on which country surprised you the most. Number 10. Nigeria. Nigeria earns its place on the list of the top contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026 for a reason that doesn't always photograph well. Scale. Not polish, not perfection. Just raw, undeniable economic mass moving in one direction. With a population of over 220 million people, Nigeria doesn't need every sector firing flawlessly to matter. Consumption alone does a lot of the work. When millions of households adjust spending even slightly, more data, more transport, more food, more services, the ripple doesn't stay local. It shows up in global growth math. This is population economics at full volume. The real engine room isn't oil anymore. It's services. Telecommunications, fintech, logistics, entertainment, and informal to formal business activity are carrying weight quietly but consistently. Nigeria has one of the largest mobile markets in the world, and fintech adoption has turned basic transactions into an economy-wide bloodstream. When people can move money, pay bills, order services, and run microbusinesses faster, GDP follows. Not dramatically, but relentlessly. Then there's the workforce. Nigeria is young in a way most advanced economies no longer are. Median age, under 19. That youth creates volatility, yes, but it also creates long-term growth gravity. Labor supply isn't shrinking. Consumer bases aren't aging out. The economy doesn't need to invent demand, it wakes up to it every morning. The IMF's projections don't frame Nigeria as an export powerhouse or a manufacturing giant. Instead, they highlight something more fundamental. Demand-driven contribution. Nigeria grows because people are there, spending, adapting, and building economic activity from the inside out. It's not glamorous, it's not smooth, but it's effective. And that's why Nigeria matters in 2026. It proves that the global economy is still shaped by demographics, not just technology or capital markets. When population scale meets momentum, even imperfect systems leave a measurable mark on world growth. Nigeria doesn't push the global economy with finesse, it pushes it with force. Number 9. Brazil. Brazil is on the list of the top contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026, not by moving fast, but by moving a lot. Brazil's growth doesn't sprint, it leans forward and applies weight. And in global economics, weight counts. Brazil contributes through a powerful combination of resource leverage and domestic demand. On the resource side, it sits at the center of global supply chains that people don't think about until they absolutely need them. Food, energy, raw materials. Brazil doesn't just participate in these markets, it stabilizes them. Soybeans, corn, beef, iron ore, and energy exports continue flowing outward, quietly supporting global consumption and industrial activity far beyond its borders. When the world eats, builds, or fuels up, Brazil is often somewhere in the background doing the heavy lifting. But exports alone don't explain its role. The other half of Brazil's contribution happens at home. A large and steadily expanding middle class keeps domestic demand alive, even when external conditions soften. More consumption means more services, more logistics, more retail, more finance. Not explosive growth, but consistent pressure, pushing GDP forward year after year. It's the kind of growth that doesn't make headlines but never disappears either. As Latin America's anchor economy, Brazil sets the pace for the region. When Brazil grows, trade partners feel it. When Brazil slows, the region recalibrates. That gravitational pull is exactly why the IMF still counts Brazil as a meaningful contributor to global growth despite its modest growth rate. Size amplifies everything. Even incremental progress becomes globally relevant when the base is large enough. The best way to understand Brazil's role is this: its growth is slow but heavy, like pushing the world economy with mass rather than speed. It doesn't rely on hype cycles or sudden booms. It relies on fundamentals: land, labor, resources, and a consumer base big enough to keep the engine running. Why it matters is simple. Brazil shows how commodities quietly prop up global GDP, not through flash, but through reliability. When the global economy needs something real, food, fuel, materials, Brazil answers. And in 2026, that still moves the numbers. Number 8. Vietnam. Vietnam earns its spot among the top contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026 in a way that feels almost quiet, but don't confuse quiet with small. Vietnam's rise isn't fueled by hype cycles or bold slogans. It's powered by manufacturing displacement, the slow, deliberate rerouting of how the world actually makes things. Global supply chains are still in motion, and Vietnam keeps ending up on the receiving end of that movement. As companies diversify away from overconcentration in a single country, factories don't vanish, they relocate. Vietnam has become one of the most reliable landing zones, not because it's trendy, but because it works. Infrastructure has improved, labor remains competitive, and production timelines stay predictable. In global manufacturing, boring is beautiful. What makes Vietnam especially interesting is how export-driven industrial growth punches far above its weight. This is not a massive economy by global standards, yet it consistently contributes meaningfully to world growth. Electronics assembly, textiles, footwear, furniture, and increasingly higher-value manufacturing all stack together. One shipment doesn't change the world. Thousands of shipments every day absolutely do. Electronics alone tell the story. Vietnam is now deeply embedded in the global tech supply chain. Not at the branding level, but at the assembly and component level where volume lives. Add textiles and light manufacturing, and you get an economy that hums constantly, even when global demand cools slightly. There's no dramatic boom, just steady output, quarter after quarter. What Vietnam benefits from most is geopolitical rebalancing, not applause. As trade tensions, risk management, and resilience planning reshape global commerce, Vietnam's neutrality and reliability become economic assets. It's the place companies choose when they want fewer surprises. That choice shows up directly in GDP contribution. Why this matters is bigger than Vietnam itself. Vietnam proves that global growth in 2026 isn't only about who is expanding fastest, it's about who fits into the world's new layout. As the global economy rearranges its production lines, Vietnam keeps finding itself closer to the center of the map. Vietnam doesn't grow because it shouts. Vietnam grows because the world keeps moving, and it's already positioned where things land. Number 7. Egypt. Egypt is among the top contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026 for a reason that can't be replicated or outsourced: location plus scale. Egypt sits where global trade has to pass, and it does so with a population large enough to turn movement into momentum. Start with geography. The Suez Canal isn't just a shipping shortcut, it's one of the most economically consequential choke points on Earth. Roughly 10 to 12% of global trade moves through this narrow corridor. Every container ship that glides through generates toll revenue, logistics activity, insurance flows, port services, and downstream economic effects. Egypt doesn't need to manufacture every good on board. It benefits simply because the world refuses to take the long way around. Then there's the build-out. Egypt has leaned heavily into infrastructure and megaprojects, and while opinions vary on their efficiency, GDP doesn't argue with spending. New cities, roads, ports, energy facilities, and transit systems inject capital directly into the economy. Construction activity, labor demand, and material sourcing all count, and when done at national scale, they inflate GDP contribution in very measurable ways. It's economic weightlifting, heavy, repetitive, and impossible to ignore. Population pressure adds the final layer. With more than 110 million people, Egypt doesn't struggle to generate internal demand. Housing, food, transportation, telecommunications, and services move constantly. Even when purchasing power is uneven, sheer numbers ensure that consumption never fully stalls. Demand doesn't need to explode, it just needs to stay on. This is why IMF projections treat Egypt as a regional economic hinge. It connects Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, not just physically, but economically. When global trade flows adjust, Egypt feels it. When regional demand shifts, Egypt absorbs it. Its growth contribution isn't flashy, but it's structural. Why this matters is simple. Egypt grows because the world keeps passing through it. Trade routes don't vote, shipping lanes don't relocate easily. Geography keeps paying dividends long after politics and cycles change. Egypt doesn't chase global growth. Global growth keeps showing up at Egypt's door and paying a toll on the way through. Number 6. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia makes its contribution to global real GDP growth in 2026 the way you'd expect a heavyweight to do it. Deliberately, visibly, and with zero interest in subtlety. This is an economy that still runs on energy, but no longer relies on energy alone. Start with oil, because pretending it no longer matters would be performance art. Saudi Arabia remains one of the world's most influential energy producers, and when prices stabilize instead of swinging wildly, oil stops being a shock absorber and starts behaving like a growth engine. Predictable revenue means predictable spending, and predictable spending at Saudi scale moves global numbers. Energy here isn't just a commodity, it's a funding mechanism. That funding flows straight into Vision 2030, which is less of a plan and more of a national spending directive. Massive public investment pours into infrastructure, industry, logistics, and urban development. Airports expand, ports modernize, rail lines stretch. Entire cities rise from the desert with the confidence of a balance sheet that says, yes, we can afford this. Whether every project becomes profitable long-term is a debate for later. In GDP terms, activity is activity. Tourism adds another layer. Saudi Arabia isn't dabbling here. It's building capacity at scale. Resorts, cultural districts, entertainment hubs, and religious tourism infrastructure all generate construction demand first, then services demand later. The economy doesn't just grow outward, it thickens. What makes Saudi Arabia stand out in IMF projections is that its growth is policy-driven and intentional. This isn't an economy waiting for foreign investment sentiment to improve or demographics to save it. It's an economy applying capital with purpose. Decisions are centralized, timelines are aggressive, and execution is relentless. When Saudi Arabia wants growth, it budgets for it. Why this matters is simple. Saudi growth is engineered, not accidental. It shows what happens when energy revenue is converted directly into domestic expansion instead of sitting idle. The result isn't flashy quarterly spikes. It's sustained global relevance. Saudi Arabia doesn't drift into global growth. It plans it, funds it, and builds it. Often all at once. Number 5. Turkey. Turkey earns its place among the top contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026 in a way that makes economists slightly uncomfortable. And that's kind of the point. Turkey doesn't grow through calm stability or textbook perfection. It grows through economic intensity, constant motion, relentless activity. The engine never really shuts off. At the center of this is a massive domestic market that simply refuses to sit still. With more than 85 million people, consumption, construction, services, and small-scale enterprise are always moving. Prices shift, conditions change, policies adjust, and life keeps going. Shops open, factories run, goods move. Turkey's economy behaves less like a polished machine and more like a crowded interchange, where traffic somehow keeps flowing, no matter how many lanes are under construction. Manufacturing is where that motion connects to the world. Turkey sits in a strategic position between Europe and Asia, and it uses that geography well. Automobiles, machinery, appliances, textiles, and consumer goods move outward in both directions. European supply chains rely on Turkish factories for speed and proximity, while Asian trade routes plug Turkey into wider production networks. It's not the cheapest producer, and it's not the most advanced, but it's fast, flexible, and close. In global trade, those three traits carry weight. Then there's the currency, often volatile, frequently debated, and impossible to ignore. Yet here's the twist. Currency volatility hasn't stopped production. In many cases, it's pushed exports harder. A weaker currency makes Turkish goods more competitive abroad, and manufacturers adapt quickly. Costs rise, margins squeeze, strategies change, and factories keep operating. Turkey absorbs shocks the way experienced boxers do, by staying on their feet. IMF projections reflect this resilience. Turkey's contribution to global growth isn't about smooth expansion, it's about volume of activity. Even when conditions are messy, economic output continues. Growth here is loud, imperfect, and persistent. Why it matters is simple. Turkey proves that growth doesn't require comfort, just activity. The global economy doesn't only move forward in stable environments. Sometimes it advances because millions of people keep producing, trading, and adapting, no matter what the conditions look like. Turkey doesn't wait for the weather to clear. It builds, exports, and expands, right in the middle of the storm. Number 4. Indonesia. Indonesia earns its place among the top contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026 by doing something deceptively simple: bringing scale and growth to the same table. Plenty of countries have growth, fewer have size. Indonesia has both, and that combination changes the math. With a population of roughly 280 million, Indonesia isn't just large, it's active. This is the 4th largest population on Earth, and a growing share of it is moving into cities, formal jobs, and the consumer economy. Urbanization here doesn't creep, it advances. New households mean new demand for housing, transport, food, energy, data, and services. When tens of millions of people upgrade their lifestyles even slightly, global GDP notices. Consumer demand is the quiet driver. Indonesia's middle class keeps expanding, pulling spending along with it. Retail, banking, digital payments, ride-hailing, food delivery, everyday activity compounds into real output. It's not flashy growth, it's cumulative growth, the kind that keeps showing up quarter after quarter. Then there's the supply side. Indonesia remains a commodity heavyweight, exporting coal, palm oil, nickel, and other critical inputs the global economy still relies on. Nickel deserves special mention. It's become strategic in the energy transition, feeding battery supply chains and electric vehicle ambitions worldwide. Indonesia didn't just export the raw material, it leaned into downstream processing, tying commodities to industrial expansion at home. Manufacturing is growing alongside resources. Industrial parks, foreign investment, and infrastructure spending are pushing Indonesia up the value chain. Factories don't replace commodities, they sit next to them, adding layers of output and employment. That blend, raw inputs plus processing, gives Indonesia resilience when global cycles shift. This is why the IMF treats Indonesia as Southeast Asia's heavyweight economy. When Indonesia accelerates, the region feels it. Trade flows adjust, supply chains rebalance, growth radiates outward. Why this matters is straightforward. Indonesia blends emerging market momentum with real size. It's not a small economy growing fast or a big one barely moving. It's a large economy still gaining speed. In a global landscape where growth is increasingly concentrated, Indonesia stands out by expanding from the middle, steadily, persistently, and at scale. Indonesia doesn't rush global growth. It carries it, one consumer, one factory, one shipment at a time. Number 3. United States. United States earns its place among the top contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026 the same way it usually does. Not by growing the fastest, but by being too large to ignore. This is economic gravity at work. When the world's biggest economy shifts even slightly, everything around it adjusts. Start with scale. The US remains the largest economy on the planet, so growth here doesn't need fireworks to matter. A 1 or 2% expansion in an economy this size adds more to global output than rapid growth in many smaller countries combined. It's the difference between jogging with a backpack and jogging with a loaded freight train behind you. Same motion, wildly different impact. Consumer spending is the real engine. American households drive a massive share of global demand, not just domestically, but indirectly across borders. When US consumers buy cars, phones, clothes, software, entertainment, or services, supply chains light up worldwide. Factories run, ships move, warehouses fill. Consumption here doesn't stay local, it echoes globally. Then come the amplifiers. Technology, services, and capital markets extend US influence far beyond its borders. American tech firms don't just sell products, they set platforms the rest of the world builds on. Financial markets recycle savings into investment at global scale. Professional services, media, research, and intellectual property quietly add layers of output that don't always show up on cargo ships, but still move GDP upward. What makes the US especially powerful in IMF projections is that even modest growth rates move global numbers. The economy doesn't need to reinvent itself every year. Stability alone becomes a contribution. When growth holds steady instead of collapsing, the world economy breathes easier. When it accelerates just a bit, forecasts everywhere get revised. Why this matters is simple. When the US grows a little, the world feels a lot. Other economies can surge or stumble, but the US sets the baseline. It's the reference point markets compare against. The demand anchor global trade orbits around. The United States doesn't chase global growth headlines. It quietly bends the curve, simply by being as large as it is and still moving forward. Number 2. India. India earns its place among the top contributors to global real GDP growth in 2026, not through a single breakthrough, but through something far more powerful: timing at scale. India isn't just growing, it's growing at the exact moment when its size finally lines up with momentum. This is the world's most populous country moving into its peak working years. Hundreds of millions of people are entering the labor force, forming households, earning incomes, and spending money, not someday, but now. That demographic wave alone reshapes global growth forecasts. When that many people start buying homes, phones, transport, food, education, and services, GDP doesn't tiptoe upward, it swells. What makes India different is that growth isn't confined to one lane. Services, IT, manufacturing, and consumption are all expanding at the same time. The IT and business services engine keeps exporting value digitally, pulling in foreign earnings without needing ships or ports. Manufacturing is scaling up, not replacing China overnight, but adding capacity where global supply chains want alternatives. Meanwhile, domestic consumption keeps rising, turning internal demand into a growth multiplier. Urbanization adds another layer of momentum. India's cities are absorbing millions of new residents every year, and urban life is expensive in the most GDP-friendly way possible. More rent, more transport, more utilities, more services, more transactions. Rural to urban migration doesn't just change skylines, it thickens economic activity. Once that process starts, it doesn't reverse easily. IMF projections reflect this reality clearly. India alone accounts for a massive share of global growth in 2026. Not because it's the richest economy, and not because it's the most efficient, but because it's combining population scale with sustained expansion across multiple sectors. Very few countries get to do that at once. Why this matter goes beyond rankings? India isn't catching up, it's reshaping the math. Global growth used to be driven by a handful of advanced economies with aging populations. India flips that script. Its growth comes from people entering the system, not exiting it. India doesn't add to global GDP quietly, it adds to it structurally. Year after year, household by household, until the numbers have no choice but to follow. Number 1. China. China remains the single largest contributor to global real GDP growth in 2026 for a reason that often gets lost in the noise: sheer economic mass. China doesn't need dramatic rebounds or record-breaking growth rates to move the world economy. It just needs to keep moving, and it does. Start with the base. China operates on an economic scale so large that even incremental expansion produces global consequences. When an economy of this size grows by a fraction, it adds more real output than many countries generate in total. That's why conversations about China slowing often miss the point. Slower doesn't mean small. It means heavy. Manufacturing remains central. China is still the world's industrial backbone, embedded deep in global supply chains that are far more resilient than headlines suggest. From machinery and electronics to intermediate goods that never make consumer labels, Chinese factories continue to hum. Some production has diversified elsewhere, yes, but diversification isn't replacement. The volume that remains is enormous, and it continues to feed global trade. Exports still matter, but consumption increasingly pulls its weight. China's domestic market is vast, complex, and active. Even cautious consumer spending at this scale translates into meaningful demand for services, housing-related activity, transportation, and digital platforms. Internal demand doesn't need to explode to matter, it just needs to stay engaged. This is where the math becomes unavoidable. Even slower growth produces massive global impact. A modest expansion in China shifts commodity demand, shipping volumes, energy use, and investment flows worldwide. Countries don't have to trade directly with China to feel it, they just need to exist in the same economic ecosystem. IMF projections make this clear. Despite structural adjustments, demographic headwinds, and policy recalibration, China's contribution to global real GDP growth in 2026 remains outsized. Not dominant because it's accelerating, dominant because it's already there, already large, and still expanding. Why this matters is straightforward. China doesn't need to grow fast, it just needs to grow. In a global economy where growth is increasingly concentrated, consistency at scale becomes power. China doesn't chase global growth narratives, it anchors them. And that brings us to the end of this countdown. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Truly. What this list really shows isn't just who's growing, it's how global growth actually works in 2026. It's not evenly shared, it's not driven by hype. It's shaped by scale, population, production capacity, and economic positioning. Some countries move fast but barely register globally. Others move slowly and still bend the numbers. Growth, it turns out, is less about speed and more about weight. Across this countdown, we saw different paths to the same outcome. Demand-driven economies powered by population, manufacturing hubs benefiting from supply chain shifts, resource-heavy nations quietly stabilizing the system, and massive economies where even modest growth sends ripples across the entire world. That's the big takeaway. The global economy doesn't rise as one, it's carried by a few. Understanding who those players are helps explain trade patterns, investment flows, inflation pressures, and where opportunity is likely to show up next. If this video helped you see the world economy more clearly, do me a favor. Like the video, it helps the channel grow. Comment below. Which country surprised you the most? Subscribe to Mr. Globe TV for more clear, grounded breakdowns of how the world actually works. Until next time, stay curious, because the global map is always changing, even when the headlines aren't.